Mm, I'm not able to share this. Uh, Niranjan? Good evening, everyone. Welcome to 𝐒𝐫𝐢𝐯𝐲𝐚 ChemVision, Process Engineering in the Pharmaceutical Industry. Today we have Dr. Srividya and Professor Richard with us, along with Professor Rahul Nabar, who is an esteemed professor in the Department of Chemical Engineering, IIT Bombay, and has obtained his bachelor's degree from the University of Mumbai and his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Over to you, Professor Nabar.
Okay, thank you, Kriti. I think it's a pleasure to be hosting this session, and I welcome all the. I see quite a good response, so thank you all for being here, and a special thanks to Dr. Srividya as well as Professor Richard. Thanks for making the time. So, just the structure of the event today. I think we'll be having two talks. Dr. Srividya is going to go first, and we're going to have Professor Richard talk after that. So I think it's a great theme. We have a mix of industry as well as academia, and the Indian perspective, as well as Professor Richard out from Hong Kong. So let me just give a quick introduction to Dr. Srividya. So she is currently heading the process engineering division at Dr. Reddy's Laboratories, or DRL. And it has been my pleasure to interact with her on several occasions, and she's very passionate about what she does. As well as interacting with students and giving them an insight into the pharma industry. So she's more than 15 years of experience, and she's done her bachelor's from the IIT and also had her graduate education at the Princeton University. So we are very happy to have you, Srividya, and over to you. Maybe I'll just introduce Richard after Dr. Srividya's talk. Right, so it's a pleasure to be here. So we'll have these two talks about 15 minutes each, and after that, feel free to send your questions over the chat, and we'll have about half an hour's Q&A and discussion after these talks. Yeah, over to you, Srividya.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you so much for inviting me for this session. Really happy to be here. I think it's always been very energizing and exciting to be amongst all the students, and it takes me back to my days in academia as well. So very glad to be a part of this. Thank you. So I'm just going to share my screen.
Sure.
You can take a second. Yeah. So I think
Yeah, so we can see the content, Srividya, but just, yeah, now it's in presentation.
Is it fine? You're not. Are you seeing this screen as well? The window of the session? No, right? Only the.
Yeah, I see your slide, the year of pharma, and I see the speaker faces. I guess it depends on how.
Okay. Yeah. Well, sometimes we need to minimize it, so that's
right.
why.
No, I think it's
okay. Great. Okay, great. Thank you very much. And to start off, I think this is the cover of CND News from December issue, where you can see that 2020 has really been not just they started with the year in pharma and they've called it the year of pharma. Naturally so, because we have all been so worried about COVID, and the pandemic is still going on, and it has really thrown the spotlight on the pharma industry. And it has also pushed a lot of us to think differently in the last 1 year. So the need of the hour, as we all know, has been diagnostics. How we know whether how we test for COVID, what drugs can we use, and immediately we had to think about repurposing existing drugs because we can't overnight discover a new drug and bring it into the market. But then simultaneously, there was a whole effort into discovery of vaccines as well. And this also threw light on, the whole complexity of drug manufacturing. Where do you even if we want to repurpose an old drug, how do we suddenly, synthesize such huge quantities of it? And I remember it was back in March and April when we started talking about remdesivir and connecting with Gilead and all these things. But then to, actually manufacture at the scale that was anticipated then, we really, had to figure out how to go about it very, very fast. And then for those who've been discovering new vaccines, understanding the tricky nature of immunity, and then understanding the whole clinical trial designs, how do we understand which drugs are effective? So it's been a very complex space over the last year in the pharma industry. And not only has this necessity been the mother of invention, but it's also been the mother of speed, I would say. So this was, from this nice article in CND News, where new technologies, technologies, I won't say they're new, they've been percolating for years, but they actually came to the forefront, like this messenger RNA for vaccines. And this is what the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine use. Very rapid antibody development. So while, the outcome of it is still to be seen at a larger scale, Eli Lilly and Regeneron independently started their development in February or March of last year. And by November, they actually had, emergency use authorization from FDA. This is a record, right? Never has a discovery and development of a new antibody therapy ever happened so fast. And of course, repurposing, existing drugs and, running them through various clinical trials to understand the efficacy. And this is just, again, a shot of the current state of, vaccines, number of vaccines that are in clinical development, number in preclinical, and this is a percentage of various, approaches that have been used, viral vectors, inactivated virus, and so on and so forth. I'm not a vaccine expert, but I just wanted to show this as an example of how many different approaches people have tried. It's really been an innovation engine in the last 1 year in the struggle to get a cure, let's say, way out of this COVID as fast as we could. So having said that, I'm going to transition a little bit into drug discovery versus development. And on the discovery aspect, we really talk about discovering new drugs, vaccines, and this is an emerging Indian scenario, and we're really happy to see, companies like Bharat Biotech out there, with their vaccine. On the development front, I think that's been going on for a while, both in terms of the CDMO space as well as generics. So that's something I would say India is very, very strong at. And if you see how the Indian industry has done, this is actually data, I'm sorry, I think the years are missing here, but this is data from IQVIA. But currently, if you look at the US generic market, Indian firms have about 1/3 of the market share. So that's a very, very significant share of the entire market. But as we talk about generics, and of course, Dr. Reddy's being a generic company, I'm focusing a little bit more on that part. The opportunity set has not increased that significantly. So if you see the number of reference products against which approved generics exist, yes, it has increased over the last 8 years, but not hugely. Whereas we find that the number of generics per reference product is inching up. So the competition is becoming tougher, while the number of reference products are really not keeping pace with that. So it is becoming a tougher world out there, even for generics. So what are these complexities at play in the generic industry? Speed, right? We really want to bring innovative and affordable medicines to reach. Yeah. And even today, when you think about the cost of vaccines and all of this, the affordability is a very, very big question out there. Then quality. So, in the pharma industry, we always worry about how much impurity we have, and we have very stringent, specifications on impurity. So any unknown impurity has to be below 0.1% of the drug. So cost, speed, I talked about that, and complexity. So we are getting into a space where it's not just the small molecules, they're biologics, there are peptides and ion nanoparticles and so on. So the complexity is increasing. At the same time, we are also worried about sustainability. So last year, in fact, China started cracking down pretty hard on this and closing units that were not, adhering to environmental norms. And in India, of course, we are working on this and we need to improve. But I'm happy to share that Dr. Reddy's is in fact one of the first pharma companies to sign up for these for the science-based targets on greenhouse gas emissions. And then we have to design for bioequivalence. So when you look at a generic drug, we have to ensure that its efficacy has to match that of the reference listed drug. And then the choice of technology, because if you want to get quality, cost, more complexity, we have to be up to date with, the technologies that are out there and suit what works for us. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the quality piece because I think this is really something that's very, very unique to pharma. So we have the current good manufacturing practice regulations outlined by FDA, and of course each country has their own set of GMP, but the FDA's GMP guidelines, I'd say, are pretty much the most stringent. And this requires, lays down requirements for the methods, facilities, controls used in manufacturing, processing, packing of a drug product. For example, once we take a batch of one product, we have to show changeover cleaning. So we have to show that if we take the next product, there is absolutely no chance of contamination of the previous product into the next product. So, the cleaning methods become very important. So that's a system-driven approach. And then there's quality in the process. So traditionally, it used to be quality by testing. So it manufactured a product and then tested to see if it met the quality. Early in the 2000s, the FDA started a paradigm shift to quality by design. So you basically build in quality into the way you develop a process, and this incorporates many Six Sigma principles, design of experiments, use of statistics, and all of these things. And now we are advancing into quality by control, and I'm sure Richard will be able to talk a lot more about this, but using model predictive control, digital twins, and all of these, real-time release testing, many of these which are becoming much more advanced. And finally, when you think of the product, we have to have very, very good analytical methods which are validated and a clear impurity profiling to make sure we have captured all the impurities. And we also worry a lot about genotoxic impurities and stuff like that. So some of you may be aware that these nitrosamines were a big thing last year, where some of the drugs which were quite high volume were found to have these nitrosamine impurities. Valsartan is one of them, and this was found to be genotoxic. So this led to a scramble to find sources of valsartan which did not have these impurities. So moving on, this is how the evolution of product development has happened in the last decade, I'd say, in the pharma industry, and particularly in the generic space where we have been operating. So we've been working from small molecules. We looked at complexity in solid forms, then we go to peptides, ion nanoparticles, and so on, various natural products, semi-synthetic approaches. Oncology has been a big thing because cancer is still one of the leading killers, I would say, oligonucleotides. And as the type of product has evolved, so has the technology and the way we do optimization and what we get into. So moving on into this, what impact can engineers make, right, in the pharma industry? And I think it's huge. I think there's drug discovery, there's development, there's development on the drug substance side, there's development on the formulation side. And the technologies are evolving so fast that and with all this concern about sustainability in the environment, we are really looking to see how we can make our processes much more efficient. So there's a lot of work on process intensification, on sustainable manufacturing. So when I said Dr. Reddy signed up for these science-based targets, it's not going to be so easy to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Right? How are we really going to do it? And if you think of a chemical industry, it is typically pretty polluting. It is very energy intensive. And what are we going to do to really make it greener? And one example of this is a focus on continuous processing now. We are moving away from our old-fashioned huge batch reactors. And there was a comment by Janet Woodcock from the FDA saying that even somebody from 1950s would recognize our manufacturing plants because they really haven't evolved much. Yeah, but now I think there's a move towards continuous manufacturing. Much better heat transfer, much better mixing. You can explore novel process windows, and I think Professor Anil at IIT Bombay is a pioneer in this. So this is the way that the industry is moving. There's a lot of work we do on particle engineering. That's basically tailoring the powder properties so that it is, amenable to the formulation, both in terms of processability, bioavailability, and so on. Many of the drugs today are in what we call the BCS class 2 or 4. And this BCS is basically bioinformation classification system, where you're looking at the solubility and permeability of the drug. So something that has a low solubility comes under class 2 or class 4. And the difference between those two classes is basically on the permeability of the drug, which is again a different matter. But on the solubility, it is very much influenced by the powder properties, the particle size, and so on. So we design our crystallization processes to engineer the particles the way the formulation teams would like to have them. Process safety, I think, is a big thing and requires a lot of engineering understanding. Looking at the exothermicity of reactions, powder safety, and despite many precautions, we still hear of so many accidents that take place. Very unfortunately in the industry. So I think this is where engineers can really make the difference between life and death. Going into new areas, there are accelerating discovery development, like you could see in the last 1 year when I talked about speed. Speed is really of the essence because we want the molecules to come out faster. And this is an example of an Eli Lilly automated plant where they've automated, it's not a plant actually, I'd say it's a lab setup at a 100 mg scale where they're using it mainly for discovery. But they have so many things that are automated, the heating, cooling, they have special functions like microwave reactions and so on, hydrogenations, workup, all of which have been automated with automatic analysis as well. And in fact, for one of our products, we are getting one of these Waters UPLC systems, which can automatically pick up samples, analyze it, dilute it, analyze it, and report the result. So these things save a lot of labor and time. And this is a way that things are moving forward. And this is also getting coupled, in fact, with, I would say, application of AI/ML based approaches for reactions screening. So for route scouting, people look at various routes that are getting now thrown out through various platforms that are available using AI/ML based approaches. I think MIT has one called ASCOS, there is Cynthia, there's another by Deep Matter, and so on. And then they combine it with these automated platforms to very quickly screen different routes of synthesis. Going further, process understanding and scale up is extremely important because we don't want to scale up a process and then understand that we are failing in the plant and we don't end up doing our R&D in the plant. Right? We have to have a very robust process to scale up. This I took as a from the scene where they talk a lot about the future manufacturing research hub. And I think this is not just at CMAC, it's at many places. And digitalization, looking at digital twins for various processes so that many things can be predicted, application of models, model predictive control, and so on. And use of process analytical technologies, so where we can actually insert a probe during a reaction or a crystallization and understand what's happening during that reaction. So here, for example, our reactant is getting consumed and we have the product being formed here. So we can track the progress of the reaction, we can map the kinetics, and that then feeds into these models. And then the selection of the right technology as well for scale-up. So this is just an example of a continuous fluid bed dryer, which we are recently looking into, where we can reduce the drying time, very efficient drying. Yeah, so all these are areas, and I think there are many more on the formulation space as well, where we look at more complex drug products. There are ophthalmics, lipid nanoparticles, microspheres, all of these that are coming up, which require a lot of understanding, into the product itself. So with this, I hope I have not taken more than my 15 minutes, but just wanted to give you a flavor of where the pharma industry is, how COVID has impacted us. And I'd say, I hope some of the lessons we have learned in terms of speeding up innovation and will carry on through the years. So thank you. And with that, I'd hand it back to Professor Rahul.
Thank you, Srividya. That was a great introduction and overview, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions that are going to come up. So just a reminder, right? There is for the attendees, there is a Q&A panel. So if you have any questions, please please do post them, and after we have both the talks over, we are going to have time for a Q&A session. With that, let's go on to our next talk, which I'm sure will be as exciting. And we are glad to have Professor Richard Lakerveld, who's a professor right now at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and he got his PhD out of Delft. And he's had a lot of papers being published, not just in the area of pharma, but also in allied areas like process design, crystallization. So I'm sure it's going to be an exciting talk. And thanks, Richard, and over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rahul, for the kind introduction. Can you all see my slide?
Yes, Richard, we can see them. Perfect.
Okay, please let me know if there is something wrong.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation to give a short talk here. I really like this kind of a student-driven events that you're organizing here. So well done, and it's my real honor to give you a little bit an overview of process engineering in pharmaceutical industry, but then from the academic perspective. So I first give a sort of a kind of a high-level overview of my view and the challenges in the field. And many things have actually already touched upon by the previous speaker, so it may sound familiar. And then I have two short examples that I've worked on in the past that I would like to show you. Of course, I cannot go in all of the details, but just to give you a flavor of the kind of research activities that are being done in this area from two examples. I myself, I have a PhD degree in industrial crystallization, and it was only later that I shifted to applications in pharmaceutical industry about 10 years ago. And it's an industry that still keeps amazing me, to be honest. Let's just look at some numbers to give you sort of a rough perspective on the global pharmaceutical industry, right? So the first thing we can say is that this is a very, very large industry, right? With high-tech products, very complex products. So the global revenues are increasing every year. We have exceeded $1 trillion in sales a couple of years ago, right? This is almost impossible to imagine, right? So how much that is. And then what's even more remarkable is that about 1/3 of this is controlled by only 10 companies, right? So these companies we call big pharma, Novartis, GSK, Pfizer, Johnson, right, etc. So those are doing new product development, for which they need a lot of capital investment. It's also a very much research-driven industry, so that's good for all of you. You're studying advanced degrees, so it's very likely you can get rewarding and challenging job opportunities in this industry. Now, if you think about the product development, right, for new pharmaceutical products, right, so if you look at the scale of this industry, right, it's remarkable to realize that actually the number of new products that come to the market every year is not that large, right? So last year, we had 53 new active ingredients approved by the American FDA. And that's actually the second highest. So 2018 was only slightly higher, right? So that's not a lot of new products coming to the market. And if you then imagine that for each of these products, it may take around 10 years to go from the initial discovery all the way through the clinical development to commercialization, and that a company has to spend about $2 billion to develop these new products, then you can understand why there is such a thing as big pharma, right? So they invest that kind of money. And it's even more remarkable that many of the new products that are initiated actually never reach commercialization, right? So they may not make it actually to the market because they're not effective enough, or perhaps not safe enough, or the market potential may actually evaporate, right? So very big industry with high-tech products. Now, so what are some of the challenges that I could come up with related to process engineering? I think you could kind of say that the processing has been a little bit neglected for some time. So in the older days, I would say that the focus is on discovery of new products. but now the manufacturing is becoming more and more important. So there have been some studies from business schools that the losses for manufacturing is still quite high. So there's lots of improvement that can be made. Environmental impact was already mentioned, so people have studied that. And typically the so-called E factors, so that is the ratio of the kilogram of product, right? So the amount of waste that you create for 1 kilogram of product can easily be up to 100 or even higher, right? So for every kilogram of product, 100 kilogram of waste can be produced. And most of that is solvents, right, with impurities. Also, as was already mentioned, there's a shift to generic drugs. Now, that is, of course, a challenge for some and an opportunity for others, right? So the challenge for the sort of big pharma is that it becomes more difficult to develop new products, right? Because existing products go off patent, so they can be produced around the world. And then it simply does not pay off anymore to develop new products because there are already good drugs for many diseases. And for existing generic manufacturers, as we just heard, right, it's the competition that is difficult. So if you have an efficient process, you can actually have a competitive edge, right? So it really pays off for generic drugs to have efficient processes. R&D costs are actually increasing. So I gave a number of about $2 billion US. Actually, that number is increasing. So it's actually getting more expensive to bring new products to the market. Another trend is that medicines tend to get more and more personalized. So diagnostics are improving. We may not need the same medicine treatment for a given disease, right? So, but how to manufacture personalized medicine is still very challenging. And as was already mentioned, of course, we live now in the COVID-19 era, right? So we see how difficult it sometimes can be to match supply with demand, right? So COVID-19, of course, is an extreme example. The whole world needs a new vaccine. Of course, there will be supply shortages, but in general, that is a problem that if there's a need for a medicine, there may not be enough supply, right? So, so what are the needs then in terms of process engineering, right? So, and what is kind of motivating, people like me who are doing research in this area. So I think, what we try to do when we try to develop new tools or new methods in process engineering, right? So what we keep in mind is that the scale up is challenging. So you want to go to the market quickly. So if you can do reliable scale up, that will be faster. Development of drugs, I don't have time to talk about that, but it goes through many phases, preclinical and then many clinical phases and then commercializations. In each of these phases, you need different quantities of material. So that is a very big scale up problem. Operation needs to be flexible, equipment utilization, so market demand needs to be adjusted. So if you can be flexible, you can adjust to changing market demands. Product quality control was already mentioned, very important in pharma, right? Because of the products are bioactive, so they need to be safe. Also, the industry is highly regulated, so you need to comply with that. Throughput is important, so how much you can make per unit volume, per unit of time. And then finally, sustainability, as was already mentioned. So CO2 and things such as solvent consumption, how can they be reduced, right? So these are some general needs that require research in companies and universities. So what are people working on in academia, right? So here is a very incomplete list, but this is kind of like a few points that I want to mention of which many research groups are working. So process modeling, as was already mentioned. So process models are very well developed, you could say, for traditional chemical processes in the bulk and petroleum industry. Very nice simulation software, but once you get solids, like in pharmaceutical processes, all of that breaks down. We don't have good tools for that. They need to be developed. So once you can develop process models, they can actually help to design and operate processes by predicting how they behave, incorporating them in advanced control schemes, etc. People work a lot with so-called process analytical technologies. So there's been quite a strong development in the last decades of things that in the past you could only do in a laboratory. And now you can do it with a probe and you can insert that in a process so you can actually better understand what's going on inside the process. You can use it for developing advanced control strategies. We saw the example of the reaction, right? So imagine if you can measure the concentration of reactants inside a reactor, you can actually decide when the reaction is completed and you can stop the batch at the right moment, right? So that kind of PAT tools can really help to control process. People work nowadays lots on so-called smart manufacturing. So there's lots of information coming in from all these analytical tools, They're all connected to the internet, so you can easily collect all of that data. So here people talk about big data, right? So it's quite easy to collect data, but how to get information out of that to make decisions, and perhaps even autonomous decisions, right? That's a whole different question that research is needed. We see a trend towards decentralized and compact manufacturing. So meaning that perhaps we should not make pharmaceuticals at very large factories at only a few places in the world and then have very complex distribution networks. Perhaps they should be made locally in a flexible way in small modular factories that can actually respond to local demand for medicines. So the so-called on-demand production of pharmaceuticals. I list here one reference. If you're interested, there have been actually a few papers in Science recently where they show new production technologies, and usually they are modular and based on continuous manufacturing. So continuous manufacturing was also mentioned already, and that is one of the big new things, is how to develop more efficient processes based on continuous flow. Okay, so this is an overview. Now, I'm sure you believe me that I myself have not been working on all of these topics. In my group, we do work a lot on continuous manufacturing, and I've also worked in the past on that. So let me share two brief examples on continuous manufacturing, just to get a flavor. So because of the time, I will not go in all of the details. If you have any questions, then please do let me know. Now, this is quite a funny thing, right? So, you're all chemical engineering students, right? You know what is continuous manufacturing, you know what is batch manufacturing. If you had any introduction course, right, to chemical engineer, I'm sure your professor taught you what is a batch process, what is a continuous process, right? I like cooking, so let's say if you want to make donuts, a batch process, you make the dough and then you put it in the oven and then it will be ready. Now, if you want to do this continuously, it will be totally different, right? So you have some moving belt. Now, for chemical processes, that's the same thing, right? If you design chemical processes, one of the first decisions you need to make is whether or not it will be a batch process or a continuous process, because it changes everything that you do later on. Now, you may have learned that small-scale processes are batch and large are continuous. And that is right now is the situation in chemical industry. So big-scale processes is just impractical to do in batch, so they're continuous. But for small-scale processes, you really do have a choice. I mean, you can really operate that in batch or in continuous, right? So now, why would you go into continuous processes for pharmaceuticals? Well, it has already been mentioned, actually, some benefits. Different people give different answers to this, but potential benefits of continuous manufacturing are scale up. You can run something longer instead of just making it bigger to make more material. You eliminate batch to batch variation, which is currently is a big problem in industry. You can enable fast chemistry, for example, that produce a lot of heat because you can remove the heat more efficiently, as we saw already before also. Recycling is more natural in continuous flow. Process control becomes more easy because continuous processes, as you know, they may operate around steady state. So it's easier to control a steady state than rather to control a dynamic trajectory as in a batch process. PET tools can be used for that. And in a continuous process, you directly push material next to the unit operation. So you can reduce the inventories, transit time, and that can be beneficial for unstable intermediate compounds, for example. And last but not least, I believe that the real opportunity is not to take an existing batch process and then just do that in continuous flow, but the real opportunity is to develop new technologies that only work well in continuous flow, right? So then you really can leverage all of the benefits. Okay, for that I have two very brief examples. So the first example is something that I worked on together with a team of students, postdocs, professors 10 years ago. So this was when I was a postdoc at the Novartis MIT Center for Continuous Pharmaceutical Manufacturing. So in that center, which is housed in MIT in the United States and was funded by Novartis, we actually built a pilot plant to make a pharmaceutical product from Novartis in an integrated, what we call end-to-end fashion. So starting from raw materials, going through chemical, all the way to final tablets, right? And there was a real API. So you can find more details in this reference, right? So just to give you an idea of what that was. So back then, it was the world's first fully integrated continuous pharmaceutical manufacturing process. So it was kind of like a proof of principle, what we wanted to develop back then. We could investigate how all these unit operations integrate, how we can control them, and how we can apply quality by design, as was mentioned already before, right? So the size of that plant, you see that here is kind of like a shipping container. It could produce about 50 grams per hour of drug product, which could be increased to 100 grams per hour if needed. Okay, so this is the chemistry. Again, I don't want to go into the detail, but just to show that it's a multi-step synthesis starting from an advanced intermediate compound. We go through several conversions, and then we crystallize the API as a hemifumarate salt, right? So there's also an impurity, which is one of the main challenges. So in the continuous process, if you build up impurities, they will be carried forward potentially all the way to the final product, right? So fairly complex chemistry, and actually for this project, the chemistry had to be redesigned so that it would be suitable for continuous flow. So the batch chemistry was not very suitable for this particular application. Okay, so this is the flow sheet. Now, this is just to impress you. There's no means that I go in all of the details here, but just to give you a little bit an idea of how many unit operations. So you can see it's like more than a dozen unit operations. All the blue circles are pumps, and then all the green, boxes, they're controllers actually and sensors. So this is an automated plant, so it can be automatically controlled and has many unit operations. So upstream for chemical synthesis, purification, workup, and downstream for tablet formation. Right. So just to give you a flavor of the complexity of this kind of process. And then what we did is, as was mentioned, actually two approaches exist here. You can build a mathematical model, so material balances, energy balances, solve them, and then you can simulate how the process behaves. Right, so this is relatively cheap and fast, but there are some assumptions that you need to make, so it may not be totally convincing. So a second approach is that you build it, and then you study that as a pilot plant. So we did both back then, so you can find literature papers on the mathematical models that we built, and how we use them to develop control strategies, for example. And also in the paper that you see on this slide, you can read more about the experimental application, right? So the equipment is typically not available off the shelf because this kind of process did not really exist. So lots of it had to be made in-house. So here we see filtration devices, dryers, a reactor, etc. And then finally, of course, the product quality is very important. So several tests have been done for this. And actually, this process could produce a product that was within specification, typical shape, API. So that is the active pharmaceutical ingredient. So the dose has to be controlled. The impurity content had to be controlled as well. And in terms of process, I think what's quite remarkable is that for this continuous process, it had 14 steps, whereas the traditional batch process had 21 steps. And the residence time could be cut down by almost one order of magnitude. So from 300 hours for batch to 47 hours for the continuous process, right? So it becomes a much faster process, and that, of course, has real benefits. Okay, so just to give a flavor of something that we do right now in my own group, we work a lot on crystallization, and crystallization relates to particle engineering, so making the right properties in one step. So one of the application areas that we work on are so-called inhalable drugs, right? So because here the control over the particle properties is very important, both for small molecule active ingredients as well as more recently also for protein drugs, right? So what is a dry powder inhalation? You may know, perhaps, people that suffer from asthma and they have these inhaler devices, so they inhale a drug, right, to self-inhalation, which is a dry powder. So here you can see how that works. So you put a capsule with a powder in a device like this, then you pinch it, and then the powder is released, and then the patient can self-inhale the drugs, and then it deposits in the drug, in the lungs, where it will absorb, right, and then the drug becomes active. So this has several advantages. It can be more stable to do it like that compared to the oral route, less side effects, etc. But what's very challenging is to make that powder, because these particles, they need to have a very narrow size range. They should be between 1 and 5 micron. Otherwise, that powder, if the patient inhales, will not deposit well. So that's a challenge to make those small particles. So now, right now, mostly they're crystallized, and then you break those particles. but that breaking is difficult and leads to a yield loss. Okay, so what we try to do is to develop a new crystallization process that could make this kind of particles in a single step so that you don't need to break them anymore. And for that, we use continuous manufacturing technologies, because for continuous manufacturing technologies, without going into the details, because there is some technical background here about crystallization, you can actually do this in flow much better than in a batch, because you need to create a very high driving force for the formation of these particles, and that just works better in flow because you can mix much more efficiently. So we developed a new crystallization process in a tube that mimics a plug flow crystallizer, and then we try to make particles within that size range in a single step. Okay, so we tested that for several applications. So after that crystallization, we directly integrated with a spray dryer, which naturally operates in continuous flow. So the spray dryer removes the solvent. So first we crystallize the particles in suspension, then we feed that continuously in a spray dryer, and then the solvent is removed, and then we can collect the dry powder. And then we test that in a device that you can see here on this slide, which is actually an artificial lung, so to say. So it actually mimics how particles deposits in the lung. So we try to develop a process that directly gives the right product properties by testing how they will deposit in the lung. So for this particular application, which is an API for tuberculosis treatment, we could optimize it so that the emitted fraction was 90%. So that's the part that leaves the capsule, and 60% of those particles would reach the right side of the lungs. Right now, that may seem low, but actually commercial products may have a low fraction, and we did not even add any excipients here to try to improve those numbers. So we tested this for other APIs as well. So we did this for beclomethasone, which is for treatment of asthma. So basically we could do the same thing. So after optimization, we could produce in a single step particles that are directly suitable for inhalation, so that you can eliminate that size correction step, which reduces the yield. So it makes the process more efficient. And this is enabled by using continuous manufacturing approaches. Okay, so more recently, we also did this for protein, for insulin, so for diabetes, so that you may not need to inject it anymore, but you can actually inhale it. But because of time, I will not go into details of that. Okay, so I've already exceeded my 15 minutes. Apologies for that, but let me wrap up. So continuous manufacturing is really exciting. I mean, we have seen now the first FDA-approved continuous manufacturing facilities. I'm sure it's going to become more important. So there are challenges for which chemical engineers are desperately needed. So how to integrate unit operations, develop new chemistry, new equipment, how to deal with the dynamics, so how to avoid material loss during startup, shutdown, traceability, quality by design. All of those issues are very challenging, and chemical engineers, I believe, have big roles to play. So, okay, with that, I would like to wrap up, but not without thanking my group, because actually they do all the work. I just look at the results. So here you see my group. So you see our campus. Actually, you may think Hong Kong is a big, busy city, which it is to some extent, but not totally, because our campus is just located outside the city, and we're in a beautiful Bay Area. We have spectacular sea view. Also in Hong Kong, you can do very nice hiking, as you see we are doing here. So we have a very international group, so students from, of course, Hong Kong, China, India, Sri Lanka, Ghana. So many different nationalities are present. So if you are considering postgraduate studies, I think it's good to know our university has some very attractive programs. So some of you, especially the more senior ones, may actually looking for postgraduate studies. So we may be a little bit below the radar, but we are a modern English-spoken, top-ranked university. We have different programs. We have Master of Science program, which is a taught program following courses. Then we have our research program, MPhil, which is kind of like a research-based master, and then of course a PhD program. So we have quite some students from IIT that actually qualify for the so-called PhD fellowship scheme, which is very attractive. So if you are top in your class, actually you should consider that. First of all, you can get a PhD degree if you complete the program, but also you will be handsomely paid for that. Now, money should not be a main driver for doing PhD studies, but once you can get it, you should not say no, right? So it's very well paid. So you get over $40,000 per year. First year you get $5,000. conference money, you get housing, so it's a very attractive scheme. So if this could be relevant for you and you could be interested in that, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I would be happy to provide more information about that. And here you can see our campus, which is really very, very beautiful. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Happy to take any questions about it.
Thanks, Richard. I think that was a lovely talk, and I'm sure some of the attendees will definitely apply, and maybe we'll see them in the future. So thanks. So let's start with the questions. Srividya, thank you. You already answered some of the questions on chat, so that's great. Some of the answers are out there. Maybe I'll take a few questions from the audience. So I think one of the questions is, Richard, you mentioned about the high E factors of pharma, somewhere around 100. And so to reduce the E factors, I think there is a question. There's two different attendees who are asking sort of the same question. What are the ways to reduce the E factor, or what has been happening? And maybe I'll add, has the E factor traditionally reduced if you see the trend over time?
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, to start with the last point, so has it reduced? I'm afraid not, to be honest. Although I don't have the exact data, because the number I gave is actually nowadays drugs need to be enantiomer pure. So usually many APIs, they are chiral, right? It's like your hands, so they're the same, but you cannot superimpose. So in the old days, you could blend them in a tablet as a mixture. Nowadays needs to be pure, so often 50% of the yield may actually get lost. So I don't think it has improved that much, to be honest, although I do not have the most recent data. And then what you can do about that? Well, obviously many things. So in my group, what we do is actually we focus on solvents, because about 85% of that waste is actually solvents. So we try to use solvents more effectively. So what we're doing in my group is we're developing actually mathematical models to predict how solvents will behave, so that you can easily select the best solvent for an integrated process, right? So like a continuous process, for example, you'll want to use the same solvent for several unit operations. So you want to use the same solvent for reaction, extraction, crystallization, if you can, because the solvent swaps. If you need to change the solvent, then you create waste. So one thing that we do in my group is we try to sort of optimize a process as a whole, and then we optimize the type of solvent simultaneously with the operating conditions of the process itself. So we have some thermodynamic model that can predict how solvent mixtures will behave. And then we have some objective function in which we try to minimize the solvent usage of a process. So testing solvent experimentally takes lots of resources. So here's another area where I think that mathematical models actually can contribute. So from molecular properties, try to predict how the solvent will behave for a reaction or a crystallization, and then try to cut on first of all, on the development time by using these kind of predictions to shortlist the candidate solvents. And secondly, try to operate and design the process so that you use less solvent waste, right? So that I think is one way. And of course, the green chemistry, right? So inherently, if you develop chemistry that is greener, as you call that, then you will also reduce that E factor. Yeah.
Thanks, Richard. So maybe in the interest of time, I'll throw questions at each one of you. So maybe the next one for Srividya. So you after IIT, you decided to go into grad school. And then you chose to come back. So what guided? I guess there's a lot of students. So what made you go to grad school? What made you come back? And how did you select pharma? Can you shed some light on your thinking?
Okay, sure. I think I always wanted to do a PhD because I wanted to stay in a technical area. I was not so enticed by the MBAs, even though many of my batchmates were getting into all the IIMs and so on. But I wanted to. I felt that true value addition comes from technical contribution, and you can see that today, even in the COVID, right? We are all looking for who can discover a vaccine that's going to save our lives. So I felt that I wanted to remain in the technical area and contribute. And of course, once I decided that, I think doing a PhD was the natural next step. And I thought of coming back to industry because I was interested, of course, in working on areas where I could see the impact in a somewhat near future. So I decided to get into industry, and particularly pharma. In fact, I started my career at Unilever Research, and then I moved into Bristol Myers Squibb, which was in pharma. And I think in pharma, particularly, I found it more rewarding because we are actually, making medicines, that are going to impact lives. I mean, Unilever was, of course, an exciting space, but I think medicines excited me a bit more than household products. So that's, yeah.
Okay, great. I think that's great to hear.
Yeah.
So maybe in the same vein, Richard, how did you decide to? So you've done your PhD at Delft and then you moved to Hong Kong. Not a very typical move, I guess. What caused you to move? How was it? And any differences or unique things about Hong Kong as opposed to the European system, which I guess a lot more people are familiar about?
Yeah, it's different, yeah, but it's actually we are quite our system is very similar to the US system.
Mm-hmm.
So our university is very much like the structure is the same as many US universities. The programs are the same. So Hong Kong is very similar to the US system. European system is a little bit different. Usually to get a PhD position in Europe, there has to be a vacancy that you need to apply to, right? So we have a graduate school, so it's admission based. So the system is a little bit different, but in terms of doing the actual research, very, very similar. So in Hong Kong, we don't have a lot of space, so labs here are small, right? In Netherlands, the labs are very big because there's much more space, right? Hong Kong, we do have usually money, but no space, so our labs are smaller. But other than that, yeah, actually, once you get started with it, it's actually very similar, yeah.
Thanks. So the next question for maybe Srividya, I know you do a lot of recruiting. So when you go to campus and you select students, what do you look for? Are there certain things that really, makes a candidate that you really miss in a candidate, or you love when somebody shows those sort of skill sets? Any comments?
Well, when we recruit, we are typically recruiting for technical roles, so core chemical engineering roles, and in some cases mechanical engineering too. So we do look for students who have a passion to do solid technical work, right? And I think that's the biggest motivator, because I think almost all students are very good, but some of them it may not be their cup of tea. So I think that's the first thing that we would look for. And in fact, once they join, we also have a program which is highly selective as well, where we do sponsor some students for a PhD or a split side PhD, so to further their career in the organization.
Thanks. Maybe the next question for Richard, what is the pharma ecosystem like in Hong Kong? I mean, Srividya mentioned, so India has a lot of generics. Is it a lot of generics? Is it MNCs doing their manufacturing? Is it a lot of homegrown companies with their own NDAs? What is the ecosystem like in Hong Kong?
Yeah, actually, we do have quite some pharmaceutical industry in Hong Kong. It's actually chemical industry in Hong Kong, of course, is not like in India. We don't have very big plants, for example, but we do have some generic manufacturers, traditional Chinese medicine as well. It's usually mostly downstream, so we don't have any API synthesis companies. So usually it's formulation, generic companies, and then of course in the mainland China there are many. It's a quite similar industrial landscape, I guess, as in India. There are many generic companies producing medicine. So we do have quite some pharmaceutical companies and actually quite some students from our department. They actually find jobs in local pharmaceutical industry. It's expanding a little bit actually, so it's quite nice. Yeah.
Great, thanks. So Srividya, maybe one question is is the pharma industry in India right now? Is it competitive in terms of hiring? To say, there's a lot of attraction even for chemical engineering students to end up in, say, finance or IT, which are quite agnostic to what skills you do. But so in terms of hiring, etc., do we see a brain drain into other sectors, or is pharma quite competitive at retaining the best talent, or what could we be doing?
I think that's a great question. I don't think we are, and I don't think it's about pharma industry alone, if you ask me. The biggest difference that I see coming from US to India is that I feel in India, the technical sector is not competitive with the MBAs. So if there is, let's say, somebody from IIT who were to join us, after a couple of years, he or she would get into one of the IIMs, do their MBA, and then the salary hike that they get after that, it's hard to match in a technical role. So I think eventually, yes, it is. I mean, I would say it's still fairly well paid, But to compare with MBAs, I think that gap does exist.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, thanks for that. So we sort of know that situation in India. Maybe Richard can tell us. You have seen the Netherlands, you have seen the US through the MIT collaboration, and now Hong Kong. Is the situation sort of similar, or is it between chemicals?
Yeah, I think the truth, especially in Hong Kong, of course, Hong Kong is a financial center. So I think if you go to banking, if pure for pay, yeah, I think it's fair to say that those jobs pay better than engineering jobs. But I would say it's not only about pay, right? It's also some challenge and rewarding work, and engineering work can be very rewarding, and especially in pharmaceutical, right? So we see now the COVID-19. So imagine you can make some contribution to that, right? So that's very rewarding. So I think it's definitely Hong Kong, yeah, sure. I mean the banking industry, the the MBAs or so, that they are more competitive in terms of salary, but the engineering jobs, they can be very rewarding as well. In Netherlands, that's a little bit different. There's more industry. In US, same thing. In the US, there's more real production, so those jobs are more plentiful there, of course.
Thanks, Richard.
I think I would just add to that. Sorry,
Sure.
Rahul. I just want to add though that while I give the comparison of in the start of a career, I think as people become more experienced even in the technical space, and especially with more entrepreneurship coming up, I think there are a lot of opportunities in the longer term. If students were to look at a technical career, but often I think people look at these short-term benefits and don't visualize that if somebody were to say, Richard talked a lot about continuous manufacturing. If somebody were to really start a continuous manufacturing company in India, that could develop at a much lower cost and get contracts in, I'm sure they would do extremely well. Yeah.
So that's a tip for the some of the students out there listening.
Yeah, definitely in the startup space. I mean, there's lots of opportunity in Hong Kong. Also, there's lots in the biotech startup companies. Students actually, directly, out of graduate school, they start up companies. It's very exciting and great opportunities.
So both of you sort of alluded to this whole the concept of digital twins, or Richard mentioned IIoT, and we keep hearing from the vendor talks and stuff like that. But how is it actually getting used? Like say at DRL, or in your experience, Richard, what are some case studies where digital twins or IIoT is actually getting used in the pharma industry? Any examples to share?
I think in the pharma, not yet so much. I think there's other industries where that will go first. Yeah, to be honest. Yeah.
What about you, Srividya? Any places in DRL where you see this sort of thing?
I would say with continuous picking up, and Richard talked about this, I think it's going to become more important because what I've realized that in the batch process, you have a lot of flexibility. I can give it, for example, I can give a temperature range saying 30 plus or minus 5 degrees, and I can cool it in 1 hour, or I can cool it in 2 hours or something. There's a lot more flexibility in the batch process in some sense. You have to have tighter controls in a continuous process because everything has to be at steady state. It cannot be, temperatures cannot be fluctuating here and there in the range of 10 degrees. And you have to know exactly what action you're going to take if some parameter deviates a bit. So I think with the kind of, and FDA loves it, right? Because it's actually quality by design, it's quality by control. So you're going to get a very, very consistent and robust output. But to build that in, the kind of controls that we need to have in place, I think these digital twins are going to become very important. So building mechanistic models, being able to predict what will be the outcomes if there are variations in the operating space, I think that's going to be very important.
Great, thanks. So since you mentioned continuous manufacturing, maybe a pretty basic question, which is, how do you deal with the concept of lots or batch lots that the FDA loves? How do you do that in continuous manufacturing? How do you make up lots if it's continuous, or do you split the process, or how do you handle that?
Yeah, actually,
Richard can take that. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, well, although I'm not a specialist in the regulatory aspect, but if you look at the definition of a lot from the FDA, it actually does not require it to be produced from a batch already before continuous manufacturing, was being developed. So actually, what a lot is about, that it's certain quantity of material with a uniform quality. And it actually literally says it's either produced from a batch or a continuous process. So the definition of lot is not related to the manufacturing method.
Got it.
So there is actually no burden already for continuous manufacturing. And in 2019, the FDA released actually the guidance for continuous manufacturing. So you interested students can go to the FDA website. You can find that. It's released in 2019. But all of these aspects related to lot size, traceability, are all described in detail. So yeah, I agree. FDA, my experiences in general, regulatory authorities are very supportive of this, because at the end of the day, this is also a push to improve quality, right? So from a regulatory point of view, they like that, right? So if the quality becomes more consistent, then that's good for everybody. Yeah, so I think there are no obstacles, fundamental obstacles in the regulation. And with the first case studies have now been approved, right? So once there are examples, then you can expect that it will accelerate. Actually.
Thanks, Richard. So maybe in the interest of time, can I get one last comment from both of you guys about where you see the pharma industry headed, and especially for students, what's in it for the future? Maybe Srividya first. You have any thoughts, any last words?
I'd say, I think definitely the pharma industry is here to last, because with the populations growing and COVID we had, other outbreaks, Ebola virus, this, that, and not just about infectious diseases, but cancer and all these things. And populations increasing, I think the need for pharma is very much there. If you ask me, an industry like the oil may go down for, more other industries, like say the solar or wind energy and so on. But then if you think of pharma, I think it's very much here to stay. And the opportunities are huge, because there is, I think, a huge scope for innovation still in pharma. So definitely, I think, at least for all the students who are listening, for their lifetime, I don't think pharma is going away. So it's a great place to be in. Yeah.
That's always good news. Yeah, Richard, thanks, Richard.
Yeah, actually, I totally agree with that. Yeah, so it's a very sustainable career. It has been growing for a long time, and it will keep on growing. I have no doubt about that. And it can be very rewarding work. I think if disease treatment, there are still problems with distribution. I mean, not everybody on the planet has equal access, for example, to medicine, and some developments could actually improve that. So there's lots of opportunity career-wise, and it can, I believe, also be very rewarding. And maybe as a final comment, I mean, pharma needs chemical engineers right now, and then, because especially in the big pharma, actually, there are many chemists actually, and not many chemical engineers, and perhaps that is a reason why they still have been doing batch for so long, because that's how a chemist works, right? But if you want to go from batch to continuous, then you need chemical engineers, right? So in my experience, actually, pharma have realized that already quite some time ago. So they are actually hiring chemical engineers, right? So because that's what you need if you want to improve the manufacturing processes. Yeah. So great opportunities, especially for chemical engineers, I believe.
Thanks, Richard. So if I'm to summarize this, it looks like the future is bright for chemical engineers. Doesn't matter if you go to the industry or academia, and at least in multiple continents, India, Hong Kong, Netherlands, US, we have a lot of perspectives, and it seems that the pharma industry is agnostic and doing very well. So thank you, both of you, for your time. So we couldn't take some of the questions, but I guess Srividya has already answered some over the chat. So thanks for that. And I would like to thank the whole Azeotropy team for organizing this, especially Kriti, Niranjan, Manan. They take a lot of effort. And I'll hand it over to Manan, who is the overall coordinator for Azeotropy, for some quick closing remarks. Manan, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So, hello everyone, I'm Manan, the overall coordinator for Azeotropy 2021. So, on behalf of the whole team Azeotropy, I would like to thank Professor Richard and Dr. Srividya for taking out their time for this event and providing all of us with wonderful insights about pharmaceutical domain in industry as well as academic perspective. I would like to thank Professor Nabar as well for moderating this session in such a nice and professional way. So thank you. Lastly, I would like to extend my gratitude to all of the guests who have been there, and I hope they got great insights about the pharmaceutical domain. So thank you, everyone. Great session.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good weekend. Thanks, Richard and Srividya. Bye.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend, everyone.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed being here. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, everyone.